If Richmond was the heart of the Confederacy, then Atlanta was its soul. One of the youngest major cities in the South, Atlanta had grown from a collection of log cabins to a thriving economic center of 20,000 people in only 30 years. Through the Civil War, it had served as a major source of supplies for the Confederate armies, and no other Southern city, save Richmond, provided as much support to the war effort as Atlanta. Grant recognized this and hoped that Sherman's 3 armies in Tennessee would be able to capture Atlanta during the course of the 1864 campaign. While all the other elements of Grant's grand strategy came apart, thanks to the ineptitude of Banks, Butler, and Sigel, Sherman once again demonstrated his strategic genius and rescued the Northern cause with a brilliant campaign. Based outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, Sherman began his campaign with 100,000 men divided into 3 armies. The largest of the 3 was the Army of the Cumberland with 60,000 men under the command of George H. Thomas, the hero at Chickamauga. General James B. McPherson had 30,000 men in his Army of the Tennessee, while General John M. Schofield commanded a smaller force of 14,000 in the Army of the Ohio. Sherman planned to maneuver all 3 forces simultaneously to outflank the rebel army defending northern Georgia and eventually destroy it. Unlike Grant in northern Virginia, whose movements were often hampered by the terrain, Sherman had plenty of room to spread out and get around the Confederate defenders. He would use that space to his advantage with telling effect throughout the rest of 1864. General Joseph E. Johnston, recently appointed to command the Army of Tennessee and its 50,000 men, realized that he could not hope to destroy Sherman's 3 armies no matter how brilliant of an offensive he conceived. Instead, he settled on a strategy of delay and limited counterattack in an effort to conserve his precious army and its irreplaceable men and material.
Johnston realized that he really had no hope of destroying Sherman's armies. They were just too powerful. So he settled on a campaign of delay with a political dimension. He realized that if Sherman took Atlanta, the Lincoln administration's future would be secured. So if he could deny Sherman Atlanta, he may just give the Democrats the strength they needed to win in the November 1864 elections. And the Democratic platform had already stated they wanted to negotiate a peace with the South. So that was the South's best hope for victory, or at least a settled peace in 1864. The problem was Johnston's campaign of delay and retreat and trading space for time did not sit well with the Southern temperament of the time.
The Confederates near Dalton, deployed on a series of hills known as Rocky Face Ridge, protected the approaches to the city. As he waited for Sherman's opening move, Johnston appealed to Jefferson Davis for reinforcements. Eventually, Davis sent him General Leonidas Polk's Army of Mississippi, a force of between 10 and 16,000 men. Polk's men, however, did not arrive in time to play a role in the first battle of this new campaign. Sherman studied Johnston's defenses along Rocky Face Ridge and concluded that they could not be breached without massive casualties. Instead of a frontal assault, he ordered McPherson's army to swing around Johnston's left flank and cross the hills at the undefended Snake Creek Gap. If McPherson's 30,000 men could push through the gap and reach the rail town of Resaca in Johnston's rear, Sherman would catch the Confederate army in an inescapable trap.
Sherman's plan was a brilliant maneuver. If McPherson had been able to capture Resaca, he would have cut Johnston's supply line and pinned him between his forces in the south and those of Sherman to the north.
Sherman unleashed his new offensive on May 9th. McPherson quickly swung around the Confederate left as Thomas and Schofield's armies made demonstration attacks against Johnston's men on Rocky Face Ridge. At first, the plan worked to perfection. The attacks on the rebel line completely fooled Johnston and distracted him from McPherson's flank march. Unopposed and undetected, his men poured through Snake Creek Gap and bored straight in for Resaca. After learning of McPherson's triumph, Sherman pounded his fist and declared, "I've got Joe Johnston dead." But McPherson failed in the next phase of his assignment. Getting through Snake Creek Gap was a major achievement, but for the plan to work, he had to take Resaca. He didn't. As his men approached the town, he found entrenched infantry waiting for him. Expecting only cavalry, McPherson presumed something had gone wrong with the plan and retreated to Snake Creek Gap to await further developments. It was a costly mistake. The Confederate garrison at Resaca numbered only 4,000 men, and McPherson had outnumbered it by almost 8-1. Sherman was surprised by the news, and when he saw McPherson a few days later, he remarked, "Well, Mac, you missed the opportunity of your life." Unfazed by the setback, Sherman quickly altered his plans. He had both Thomas and Schofield disengage at Rocky Face Ridge, then move south to rejoin McPherson. Alerted to the Union move, Johnston began abandoning Rocky Face Ridge on May 12th, marching south to defensive positions around Resaca. After a day of skirmishing, the Northerners launched a full-scale assault on the rebel works on May 14th, but the well-entrenched rebels cut them down. The following day, Sherman ordered Hooker's 20th Corps to hit the rebel right flank. As Hooker's men marched forward, they collided with Hood's Confederates, who had moved into the open to launch a counterattack of their own.
As this battle unfolds around Resaca, Sherman sends once again his maneuver arm, McPherson, across the Oostenaula River in a wide sweeping flank move against Johnston, and McPherson tries to drive into Johnston's rear.
This time, Johnston caught wind of McPherson's movements and reacted quickly. Putting his entire army on the road, he retired across the Oostenaula and fell back to Cassville. The news of General Johnston's retreat from Resaca was received throughout the South with a mixture of worry and anger. The citizens of Atlanta howled with protest over what they perceived as Johnston's lack of tenacity, and Jefferson Davis grew increasingly disillusioned with his general. If Johnston were to salvage his career and his campaign, he would need to strike a telling blow against Sherman's armies. Johnston saw the withdrawal to Cassville as an opportunity to draw Sherman's armies into a trap. As he pulled back, he divided his army so that it appeared the main force had moved to Kingston, when in reality the bulk of his men marched on to Cassville. Johnston hoped to lure a portion of the Union Army to Cassville, while the rest of Sherman's force moved on Kingston.
To spring his trap, Johnston selected Hood's Corps to deliver the hammer blow against the Union troops coming down the Adairsville Road. And this really was to Johnston's credit, because Hood had been a constant critic of Johnston's policies, and yet Johnston gave him basically the position of honor for this particular trap. And he did so because he recognized that Hood's temperament and his aggressiveness and his instincts were really all probably best suited more than any of the other corps commanders to deliver this blow against the Union.
Sherman did not oblige Johnston. Relying on his strategic mobility, he sent his three armies around Johnston's left and right and straight down the center as well. McPherson's army moved towards Kingston, while the remaining two armies marched on Cassville, with Thomas heading straight down the Adairsville Road, and Schofield moving east, then south, to hit the rebel right flank. With Hooker's 30th Corps in the van, the Army of the Cumberland nearly walked into Hood's trap. But just before the Confederates planned to launch their assault on Hooker, a Union force materialized behind Hood's corps. Hood was totally surprised by this threat to his unanchored right flank and his rear. Instead of launching his surprise attack, he pulled back, tied in with Polk, and bent his line around the northeast part of Cassville. Johnston's best opportunity to deal a telling blow to Sherman had been lost.
When Johnston's trap doesn't work, and the Federal armies are continuing to advance unhindered. He elects to pull back to some high ground beyond Cassville, but his Corps commanders object that the area isn't defensible, so he elects to move back even farther south and takes up positions around Altoona.
Sherman concluded that the Confederate position at Allatoona was too strong to attack directly. Again, relying on his strategic mobility, Sherman's armies cut loose from their railway supply line and marched south in an attempt to turn the Confederate left flank. Johnston reacted quickly to the threat. Putting his army on the road, he swung southwest out of Allatoona and tried to punch into Sherman's unprotected rear. It didn't work. Instead, the two sides met at New Hope Church on May 25, 1864. Hooker deployed his men in a narrow, deep formation that had been successful at Spotsylvania. But in the thick woods surrounding New Hope Church, the choice was a poor one. The Union assault was cut to ribbons. Stymied by the Confederate defenders at New Hope Church, Sherman ordered General Oliver Howard to swing to the left and attack the far right Confederate flank. Stumbling through the dense woods, Howard's men soon became disoriented. On May 27th, Howard sent a message to Sherman that read, "I have found the enemy flank, I think." Without a clear picture of the tactical situation, General Howard ordered an attack in the late afternoon of May 27th that became known as the Battle of Pickett's Mill. The assault regiments quickly got mixed up and lost in the dense forest. Some never entered the fight. Others drifted away from their objectives.
At about 6 o'clock, the Union attack develops, and the men go in uncoordinated waves. Part of the attack wave goes right into an open ravine and gets caught out in the open and is just butchered by Confederate fire. A subsequent attack at 7 o'clock accomplished nothing either, and that forced ultimately the Union troops to pull back their lines.
Howard's corps lost about 2,400 men in a fruitless assault. Johnston, encouraged by the situation, decided on a counterattack at Dallas against the Union far right wing, hoping to exploit any weakness or possible withdrawal. On May 28th, Southerners under the command of Lieutenant General William Hardee probed the Union defensive line held by Major General John Logan's men from the Army of the Tennessee. The rebel assault enjoyed some initial success and briefly drove the Federals from their line of breastworks. General Logan soon rallied his troops, however, and they swept forward, retaking their line and inflicting severe losses on the rebels. Nearly 1,000 Confederates fell in just a few hours. On June 1st, Sherman's cavalry occupied Allatoona Pass, a vital link on the rail line that connected Sherman's base at Chattanooga with points farther south. Painfully aware that his advance on Atlanta was absolutely dependent on his ever-lengthening supply line, Sherman abandoned his position at Dallas on June 5th and began moving toward the railhead at Allatoona Pass.
Sherman is a logistician first and last. He will not move south unless he has 100 locomotives and 1,000 freight cars. He makes that very clear. This is going to be a war of logistics. This is for Sherman a modern war. It's a war of numbers.
Sherman had marched to within 30 miles of Atlanta in only a month of campaigning. He had done it not by blunt force, but by maneuver, using the vast southern countryside to his advantage as he swung his armies around Johnston's every time the Confederates dug in. But in June, Sherman's best asset, his mobility, would be eliminated thanks to the weather and a cunning Confederate deployment. Following the Battle of Dallas, both sides paused to reassess the strategic situation. On the Union side, Sherman's armies had suffered over 9,000 casualties since the start of the campaign. His men had become so wary of earthworks and trenches that Sherman began to grow frustrated.
Fresh furrow in a plowed field will stop the whole column, and all begin to entrench. We are on the offensive, and must assail and not defend.
The Federal troops had been on the march for the better part of a month, and as they traveled ever deeper into Georgia, the combination of heat, dust, and insects made their lives miserable. One private from Indiana wrote,
"The men's bodies are alive with creeping things of every description. Chiggers are big and red as blood. They will crawl through any cloth and bite worse than fleas and poison the flesh very badly. Every man from colonel down is broken out horribly and cannot get a moment's rest for the intolerable itching."
Tortured by Georgia's plentiful insect population and harassed by Confederate skirmishers, Sherman's men trudged steadily south. Sherman, too, was suffering. Just after the Battle of New Hope Church, he learned that his newborn son, Charles, wasn't expected to live. Having already lost his eldest son, Willie, Sherman needed every ounce of resolve to stay focused on the campaign ahead.
Though he'd suffered about 8,500 casualties in his army, Johnston had accomplished his objectives to this point in the campaign. He had prevented Sherman from scoring a decisive victory. He had prevented Sherman from achieving a breakthrough that led to the capture of Atlanta, and his force was largely intact. Yet his own subordinates were highly critical behind his back of his policies, especially John Bell Hood, who actually began a whisper campaign against him in Richmond. And this fact, plus the fact that the newspapers in the South became highly critical of him as well, ultimately led to Johnston's undoing.
In spite of mounting criticism, Johnston decided to remain on the defensive and wait for Sherman to come to him. But the wily Federal commander refused to cooperate, preferring instead to continue his flanking strategy. Wrote Johnston to his wife, "Sherman is so cautious that I can find no opportunity to attack him." The frustration expressed by Johnston knew no rank. A surrendering private told his captors,
"Sherman will never go to hell. He will flank the devil and make heaven in spite of the guards."
But by mid-June, Sherman was ready to change his tactics. With the roads turned to mud thanks to nearly continual rain, Sherman realized he could not maneuver around Johnston, who had deployed his men across the face of Kennesaw Mountain just 20 miles from Atlanta. Reasoning that Johnston expected another turning movement, Sherman decided to attack.
Johnston had consolidated his army on the line at the Kennesaw Mountain position. And this was a pretty formidable piece of terrain, and he used the time effectively as Sherman's army closed in to fortify it even further. And it was such a strong position that the veteran Federal soldiers were dismayed by it. They were, in fact, even taking bets about whether or not they'd be successful in the assault.
On June 27th, 13,000 Union troops stormed the Confederates on Kennesaw Mountain. Federal attackers overran the first rifle pits but were slowed by the rough terrain, then stopped by savage fire from the dug-in Confederates. Intense rifle and artillery fire cut the front ranks to pieces, and the rear regiments had difficulty getting into the fight. As the temperature soared to nearly 100 degrees in the shade, the Yankees continued to throw themselves against Confederate breastworks that rivaled those at Petersburg. One Southerner recalled,
"The Federals seemed to walk up and take death as coolly as if they were wooden men."
Sam Watkins, a Southern private who had received his baptism of fire long before at Shiloh, recalled the slaughter that took place near a salient later known as the Dead Angle.
"I've heard men say that if they ever killed a Yankee during the war, they were not aware of it. On this memorable day, all that was necessary was to load and shoot."
As the battle along Kennesaw Mountain unfolded, the gunfire actually sparked a number of forest fires, and caught in these fires, as had happened at the Wilderness and at other battles, were wounded men. And these men literally were burning alive, and their screams for help echoed through the memories of the veterans of this battle for the rest of their lives. And in fact, in one portion of the line, a truce was called so that both sides could go and save these guys from these flames.
After the brief armistice, hostilities soon recommenced, but nowhere could the Federals crack the Confederate line. In 3 major assaults into a hail of shot and shell, not one breastwork fell. As the battle raged, one Confederate described the scene within the trenches.
"I never saw so many broken down and exhausted men in my life. Wet with blood and sweat, our tongues were cracked and parched for water, and our faces blackened with powder and smoke. Our dead and wounded were piled indiscriminately amongst us."
By early afternoon, Sherman recognized the futility of further attacks and canceled the operation. The Federals had lost 3,000 killed and wounded and had no gains to show for them. Though Sherman never admitted that the assault on Kennesaw had been a mistake, he would never again order an attack on a fortified and strongly held enemy position. After the repulse at Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman returned to a war of maneuver, and once again the Federals slipped around Johnston and made for the Confederate rear. On July 2nd, the Yankees disengaged at Kennesaw and resumed their relentless march on Atlanta. As Sherman's army streamed toward the city, Jefferson Davis suddenly removed Joe Johnston from command.
Johnston had been very good for the Army of Tennessee. When he had taken it over from Braxton Bragg, it had been a dispirited mess, and he'd rebuilt it into a fighting force with very high morale. Now, the Army went to John Bell Hood, and Hood's promotion actually generated some protests from Robert E. Lee, who thought that Hood was too reckless for the job. In fact, he wrote home to Richmond and said that Hood was all lion and no fox, and subsequent events really bore out this assessment of Hood.
For his part, Sherman was pleased with the Confederate change of command, seeing in Hood a bold fighter more likely to put himself out on a limb, which the Federal commander had every intention of cutting off. He didn't have long to wait. On July 20th, just 2 days after taking command, Hood sent his army against the Union forces of George Thomas, hoping to catch the Yankees as they crossed Peachtree Creek. The attack was late, however, and by the time the Southerners reached position, the Federals were across the creek and well deployed. 5 Union divisions drove an equal number of rebels back with heavy losses. Hood sacrificed 3,000 of his men for no gain. And as the Confederates withdrew, word came that McPherson was marching on Atlanta from the east. Determined to remain on the offensive, Hood sent Hardee's corps on a wide march designed to get his men behind the Union left flank. Hardee was supposed to drive into the Union lines just as another Confederate corps struck McPherson's main line astride Bald Hill.
Hardee breaks contact with the Union forces to his front, withdraws his corps, and they began an all-night march to attack McPherson. but they're moving at night through unfamiliar terrain, and they're slowed down by a variety of obstacles, so it isn't until noon or thereabouts when they're finally ready to attack.
The Confederates advanced, expecting to find the open rear of McPherson's corps. Instead, they encountered Union troops under the command of General Thomas Sweeney, well positioned to delay their attack. The Federals quickly deployed into skirmish lines, and firing broke out as the men of Bates and Walker's divisions advanced. Instead of achieving surprise, the Confederates had a real fight on their hands. The Battle of Atlanta had begun. Confederates, exhausted by their all-night march, failed to make any headway against the resolute defense of Sweeney's bluecoats, and eventually the rebel divisions pulled back into the woods. To Walker's left, Cleburne's division of crack troops found a gap in the Union lines and poured through it, nearly reaching the base of Bald Hill in the Federal rear. Afternoon, McPherson was fully aware of the danger to his command. He summoned General Logan's men from the Federal right, then went forward to inspect the imperiled Union position.
During this action, McPherson went forward and ran into a rebel skirmish line. And while he was trying to get away, the skirmishers shot him in the back and he subsequently died. Well, General Logan at that point assumed command of the army.
In a superb display of personal leadership, Logan rallied the Union troops and held Hardee's men at bay. As the Confederate assault wave was stopped, then finally repulsed, Hood ordered Benjamin Cheatham's corps to attack the western approaches to Bald Hill. Falling upon a thinly held section of the line, the Confederates quickly drove the defenders back. Logan shifted his men to meet the rebel assault, and the Union reinforcements swiftly re-established control of the situation. The Confederates gradually fell back in the face of the Union counterattack. The fighting continued late into the afternoon, but the Confederates succeeded only in adding to the growing list of casualties. In 2 battles, Hood's attacks cost the Southern cause about 8,000 men. As night fell, the exhausted rebels filed back into Atlanta. With Hood's Confederates behind the defenses of Atlanta and a frontal assault out of the question, Sherman began searching for a way to force them out. Lacking sufficient manpower to stage an effective siege, Sherman turned his attention to the one rail line to the city that remained in Southern hands.
Sherman sent 2 detachments of cavalry under General McCook and General Stoneman down to tear up the rail line, but they were intercepted by a very strong Confederate force and defeated. In the process, about 700 Union troops, cavalry troopers, fell into Confederate hands and were taken to Andersonville. Ironically, Andersonville prison had been one of Stoneman's secondary objectives.
With the failure of the Union cavalry, the job of cutting the Confederate supply line fell to the infantry. Hood attempted to block the Union move, and on July 28th, the two forces met at Ezra Church. Though they succeeded in preserving the rail line, in less than a month, Hood had lost nearly 20,000 men, and his army was rapidly losing its offensive capacity. While the combatants glared at each other from behind their line of trenches around Atlanta, Admiral David Farragut laid his sights on Mobile Bay, the last port on the Gulf of Mexico open to the Confederacy.
Farragut, who had been so successful at New Orleans, now decides to literally sail past the guarding forts out of the bay, into the bay, confront the ironclad and other vessels in the bay, and capture it as a naval operation. And he succeeds in doing so, along with the famous quote, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," referring to what were called torpedoes then, which were actually mines in the water that sank the very first ironclad that tried to enter the bay. And Farragut, taking a look at this, said, "Keep sailing forward, we're not stopping," and the line of battle did, in fact, penetrate into the harbor and batter the ironclad into submission, and they captured Mobile Bay. And finally, the last port on the Gulf of Mexico open to the Confederates was closed.
Though it was months before Mobile itself fell to the Union, the naval engagement at Mobile Bay signaled the end of an era. Never again in this or any other war would ironclad and wooden ships battle for supremacy on the sea. Indeed, the American Civil War was one of the last major conflicts in which fights between opposing fleets were conducted primarily by wooden vessels. More than just the end of an important source of supply, Mobile Bay brought down the curtain on the age of wood and sail. After a strategic pause to gather his forces for a final push to capture Atlanta, Sherman set his army in motion in late August, wheeling toward Jonesboro and the vital rail line south of the city. Hood responded to the threat with predictable zeal. On August 30th, he sent Hardee's Corps down to block the Federal move, but when the leading Confederate divisions reached Jonesboro, they found a strong Union force already entrenched. The next day, Sherman's forces launched an attack of their own. At a bend in the rebel position, two Union regiments broke into the Confederate lines. The Union attack wiped out the entire color guard of the 6th Kentucky Infantry, and as the Southerners reeled back, the attackers captured the regimental flag and waved it over their heads to taunt the dispirited, retreating rebels. The defeat at Jonesboro gave Sherman control of the lines of communications into Atlanta, which presented Hood with little choice. After blowing up his military stores, his army withdrew. On September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta surrendered. Sherman gleefully telegraphed Washington the news. "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won."
The twin victories at Atlanta and Mobile Bay really doomed the Confederacy because they ensured Lincoln's re-election chances for November of 1864. And with Lincoln in the White House and the Republicans controlling Congress, there would be no negotiated peace that assured the Confederacy's independence. From this point on, they were fighting a lost cause.
An air of gloom descended over much of the Confederacy after the fall of Atlanta. Mary Boykin Chestnut, a South Carolina diarist, saw doom approaching.
"Since Atlanta, I've felt as if all were dead within me. There is no hope. We're going to be wiped off the earth."
Toward that end, General Sherman would soon begin a campaign into the very heart of the Confederacy. After the capture of Atlanta, Sherman struggled to protect his extended communication lines that stretched all the way to Nashville. Confederate cavalry constantly raided his line of supply, and Hood had moved his depleted army north of Atlanta to further threaten Sherman's rear. Sherman soon became exasperated with the Southern strategy. To General Grant, he made a bold proposal. He wanted to ignore Hood and embark on a march to the Georgia coast.
I could cut a swath through to the sea and divide the Confederacy in two. It would demonstrate to the world that we have a power which Jefferson Davis cannot resist. I can make the march and make Georgia howl.
President Lincoln, who, like Sherman, subscribed to the concept of total war, resisted the idea at first, but in the end, he approved Sherman's plan. Leaving General George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland behind to defend Tennessee, Sherman cut loose from his supply lines and disappeared into the southern countryside in mid-November, embarking upon one of the most famous military operations in American history, the March to the Sea.
The military art is a logistic art, is the art of moving armies to a concentrated goal. The part of Georgia he's going through is one of the richest parts of the South. He's not moving away from his supplies, he's moving through them.
With the exception of scattered militia units and a small force of Southern cavalry, nothing stood between Sherman's army and Savannah. There was no stopping the Bluecoats in their relentless drive across Georgia.
Sherman's march to the sea not only damaged everything that it came across in terms of factories, homes, and foodstuffs that will not go now to feed the Southern armies, obviously. But psychologically, it was a huge blow to the South, because here's a Union Army able to do whatever it damn well pleases, ripping through the heart of the South and basically saying, we're going to go through every inch of the South. We're going to come through the Carolinas. Anywhere we want to go, we can go. Anything we want to burn, we can burn. Anything we want to take, we can take. And this psychologically really did a lot to destroy whatever morale was left among a lot of Confederates.
By December 11th, Sherman was within 4 miles of Savannah. Unwilling to risk a frontal assault against the city's defenses, the Union commander ordered an assault on Fort McAllister, several miles south of Savannah, to secure a line of communications. After a fight that lasted less than an hour, the southern fortress surrendered. Fearing a similar fate, the defenders of Savannah abandoned their fortifications on the night of December 20th. The next day, Lincoln received a jocular telegram from Sherman.
I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and about 25,000 bales of cotton.
The swath of destruction that lay in Sherman's wake bore testament to the devastation wrought by his men. Mary Chestnut wrote,
They say no living thing is found in Sherman's track, only chimneys, like telegraph poles, to carry out the news of his attack backwards.
While Sherman burned his way through Georgia, General Hood struggled to defend the heart of Dixie. Knowing his 35,000 men could not hold off Sherman directly, Hood decided to launch a counteroffensive into Tennessee with the idea of cutting Sherman off permanently from his supply lines. If successful, Hood's strategy would force Sherman to turn back and fight for Nashville. Sherman was bewildered and delighted by the move.
If he will go to the Ohio River, I'll give him rations. My business is down south.
When Sherman decided to march to the sea, he couldn't take everybody with him, and he also had to contend with the Confederate Army that was still in Georgia under John Bell Hood. So he put the defensive forces in Tennessee under Thomas. And John Bell Hood obliged by moving north instead of chasing Sherman, and went north with the purpose of trying to recapture Nashville and reverse the situation of the loss of Atlanta.
In one of the Civil War's most bizarre scenarios, the Confederate and Union armies turned their backs to one another and marched in opposite directions. Both would leave their own unique legacy of destruction. As Hood's army of some 39,000 veterans crossed the Tennessee River and moved north, General Thomas was engaged in assembling and training a force at Nashville. The Confederate move prompted the Union commander to send John Schofield with some 34,000 men south to Pulaski to delay Hood. The stage was set for an epic struggle by veteran troops on both sides. Hood moved rapidly north in an effort to swing behind Schofield and seize the crossings over the Duck River at Columbia. A cavalry engagement alerted Schofield to Hood's intentions, and he quickly pulled his men out of Pulaski and beat a hot path back to Columbia, arriving there just ahead of the rebel troopers. Hood's infantry was slow in coming up, and it wasn't until the 27th of November that the majority of his units arrived. That same night, Schofield moved his men to positions north of the Duck River, burning the bridges behind him as he withdrew. Deciding against a frontal assault, Hood left 2 divisions at Columbia to harass the Federals on the opposite bank and took the bulk of his army east in search of a river ford. With General Nathan Bedford Forrest troopers again in the lead, the Confederates began crossing on the 29th and headed for Spring Hill, hoping to cut off the Union forces and crush them. However, a Union force under David Stanley was underway north with Wagner's division and most of the Army's wagons and artillery. As the leading Confederates closed on the town, Forrest's troopers dismounted and moved forward in a skirmish line, expecting to brush aside the small Federal force stationed there. Stanley, however, had other plans. Arriving at Spring Hill just ahead of the rebel troopers, he calmly deployed his units and threw the surprised Gray cavalry back in disarray. Before Forrest could regroup, Union reinforcements were brought up, and they deployed just in time to meet a second Confederate attack. Though the Federals spoiled Hood's initial bid to seize Spring Hill, he could still carry the day, for at that very moment the division of Patrick Cleburne was approaching the town from the south. Withering fire from the Yankees devastated Cleburne's flank, and he pulled his division back to reform. As both sides maneuvered reinforcements into position, the ever-lengthening shadows paralleled the odds of a Confederate success on this day. Night had fallen by the time the rebels were finally in position to attack. Schofield was well aware of the situation at Spring Hill and moved rapidly to get out of the trap Hood had set. On the night of November 29th, he marched his army north towards Spring Hill. Inexplicably, Hood had failed to block the road leading into the town, and the long Union columns were able to bypass the encamped Confederates throughout the night. By daybreak, Schofield and his army were digging in near Franklin, just 15 miles south of Thomas at Nashville. Hood was incensed when he discovered that the Federals had escaped once again. He immediately set his army off in pursuit, and so it was that late on the afternoon of November 30th, Hood's forces hove into view before the hastily prepared Union line. The Confederate veterans studied the Yankee entrenchments with a practiced eye, yet did not quail before them. Sam Watkins was there.
We were willing to go anywhere, or to follow anyone who would lead us. We were anxious to fight.
For their part, the Federals believed that the Confederates would not attack, and expected to pull out and march to Nashville. Schofield had deployed his forces just south of Franklin, with his line anchored on the left and right by the Harpeth River. It was a strong position, but due to a misunderstanding of orders, 2 brigades from Wagner's division were deployed forward of the main line. Their presence in the middle of the field would soon be a factor in the sequence of events that followed. At a council of war with his generals, Hood rejected the urging of Forrest for a flanking maneuver and launched into a tirade berating his commanders and questioning the will of their men. As the meeting broke up, the outspoken Forrest vented his frustration.
Let me tell you something, General Hood. If you were a whole man, I'd whip you within an inch of your life. God damn it. Orderly!
At about 4 p.m., the Gray columns moved forward to mount a frontal assault that would leave an unequaled legacy of bravery and hopelessness. Yankees stood in disbelief as a seemingly endless line of Confederates marched steadily forward, shocked that the rebels would assault on such a heavily defended position. One Federal soldier wrote that it seemed as if the whole South had come. In front of the main line, Wagner's men realized that their position would be quickly overcome. After firing a few volleys, they broke and ran. Seeing Wagner's brigades in flight, the rebel line surged forward with a yell, following the Yankees and using them to shield their advance. The Confederate assault fell on the weakest section of the Federal line, the point at which the road to Franklin intersected the Union fortifications. Cleburne's division surged through the gap, and it looked for a moment as if the whole position would be carried. But the Federals rallied almost immediately. Emerson Opdyke's brigade had been placed in reserve for just such an event. He led his men forward in a counterattack that struck the rebels with full fury. Exhausted by their charge through the Federal line and the intensity of the fighting, the Southerners were driven back by the determined Federals. Opdyke's men poured fire on the retreating Confederates, and General Cleburne was killed, along with scores of his men. Private Sam Watkins recalled the scene.
I have never seen an army so confused and demoralized. We were anxious to flee, and the whole thing seemed to be tottering and trembling.
Schofield's veterans had succeeded in meeting this first attack, but the fight was far from over. To Cleburne's right, Stuart was compressed by the river as it advanced. Hit on the flank by Federal artillery from north of the river, the attack was further broken up when it encountered Osage-Orange hedges. To make matters worse, Stuart's men encountered Federal troops armed with repeating rifles. The inability to advance cohesively in conjunction with the intense rifle and artillery fire doomed the Confederate assault. In spite of suffering appalling losses, the rebels continued to throw themselves against the Federal line. The 1st Missouri Brigade lost more than 60% of its men in a matter of minutes. In other units, the story was much the same. Elsewhere on the line, John Brown's division forced its way through the Union lines just west of the Columbia Pike. Once again, the veteran Yankees stood their ground and forced the rebels back over the barricades. Further to the left, the men of Bates' division could make no headway against the stubborn and well-positioned Federals. As the sun began to slip toward the horizon, Hood sent wave after wave forward, only to have them cut down by vicious fire from Schofield's troops. Rebel officers fell at an unprecedented rate. A dozen Confederate generals and more than 50 regimental commanders were either wounded or killed. Many units lost virtually all their ranking officers, until captains led brigades and sergeants led regiments. Eventually, darkness, exhaustion, and despair halted the Confederate attacks. Late that night, the Federals quietly abandoned their works, leaving in their wake the shattered dreams of one Confederate general and the decimated remains of a once proud army. As Hood fought his way to Nashville, General George Thomas's army of some 80,000 Union troops had plenty of time to dig in and clear fields of fire. Methodically preparing for Hood's arrival, Thomas's men ensured that when the Confederates arrived, their attacking brigades would be trapped in one of the worst killing fields in American history. Pausing only briefly to bury his dead, Hood set out in pursuit of Schofield on December 1st. Terribly depleted and poorly supplied, the Confederate Army of Tennessee that marched on Nashville was a shadow of its former self. Hood's forces settled into positions near the city on December 2nd, while Thomas's warm and well-fed Yankees continued to train and prepare. The Union general was in no hurry to fight, believing that when the battle was joined, he would rout the Southern Army. Lincoln, however, grew impatient with Thomas and threatened to replace him unless immediate action were taken against Hood. On December 15, 1864, Thomas struck, and in a series of battles lasting 2 days, the Federals completely destroyed the last remnants of Hood's army.
John Bell Hood's smaller army was thoroughly crushed by a very well-deployed and well-led army under Thomas. And unfortunately for Thomas, instead of getting credit for this, all that Grant remembered was he kept ordering Thomas to attack. The weather was terrible and it had to be delayed. And Grant only remembered that Thomas seemed to take his own sweet time to do this, and not that he had inflicted a major defeat on the Confederates, which was really unfortunate because Thomas deserves more credit than that. He was a good general and he won an important battle for the North.
It was over in Tennessee. It had ended at Nashville. But in reality, the die was cast at Franklin. The Western Confederacy died with the Army of Tennessee, but in the East there remained the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee. It would be in the East, in Virginia and the Carolinas, that the final chapters of this long and deadly Civil War would be written.